Welcome back to It's Not History, the podcast where the past is never dead, it's not even past. This is the second episode in our series, Conestoga Town. In the first episode, I talked about my goal of wanting to start a straightforward, interesting podcast based on a simple question, which was, what happened to the people the river is named after? The people in the river both being called the Conestoga. But then what I discovered was that what I thought was a simple answer to this question, a tragic event in the winter of 1763, called the Massacre of the Conestoga, was not this simple solution that I was looking for. In fact, it was totally the opposite. Because when I started diving into these events and the subject and started looking closely, where there was supposed to be a simple, straightforward narrative arc, the last of a tribe of Indians killed by the first of a wave of settlers, what I found instead was a door that opened into parallel worlds, and that I discovered that these events were just an intersection, a point on a line that led to other decisive events that I didn't know much, if anything, about, and that the story of the Paxton and Conestoga represented a sort of historical tipping point, a tipping point that separated the worlds before and after in a hugely decisive way, and that some of this I dimly knew about, and the rest I discovered I didn't know anything about, and that my understanding of this, or my lack of understanding, has everything to do with my perspective, because my perspective, the one I inherited, and maybe you too, is the perspective of descendants of European settlers who landed on this shore and looked west across a new continent, and saw opportunity. And that's the perspective of one of the groups at the center of this story, the Paxtons. But there's another, and that's the perspective of Native people, then and now, whose perspective is facing east, from their home, seeing my people kicking down their door. And look, I know this is a lot to unpack. I get it. If you're having an issue with this or finding it uncomfortable to wrap your head around this, you're not alone. Like most people, I've spent a lifetime looking at the world through the lens of my own experience, and I think, like most people, my natural reaction to changing lenses is either to get dizzy or get a headache. And I've found much of this subject more than a little overwhelming, and frankly, more than a little challenging to put together in a podcast that hopefully makes sense to you. But the challenge of sticking with it has been worth it for me, and I hope it is for you too, so hang in there. So let's start to look at the sources that surround and inform the story. And then from there, maybe we can begin to experience the world that was then and is now through different lenses. And while I found plenty that's new and surprising and occasionally shocking, my goal here is to show how familiar events and documents might be seen in new ways from a different perspective. And one of the things that starts to come into focus, to keep straining this metaphor, is that where once you saw a single war of American independence, started by all the people we're familiar with, the Franklins, the Jeffersons, the Adams, for all the high-minded reasons that we're familiar with, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what you start to become aware of is that there were in fact 3 American wars of independence going on in the 1700s. And that 2 of these conflicts were started in parallel a decade before the one we all know about in 1775. Started and fought and pursued for completely different objectives and for altogether different reasons, but for reasons that were just as consequential to the European settler or Native American, fighting either on the frontier of a new continent or the gateway of their home, depending again on your perspective. But we'll get there. And to get there, I think maybe the best way that I've found is to go to the sources, which is what we'll be doing. And so with the help of people like Will Fenton and Scott Paul Gordon and other archivists and historians, we'll be looking at the words and images that the people who lived then used to try to change their worlds. Worlds that are both surprisingly familiar and shockingly different than ours. So maybe to start, what I'd like to do is to share my source, personally. So let's start at the place that is the source for my perspective. which also conveniently happens to be the place that is the source for much of this story. So if you're up for it, let's return to where this all started. The source for the Conestoga, both the river and the people, the Paxton, and me, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So let's return to the scene of the crime. And if our goal is to understand the how and when of these events and how they're not history, you couldn't pick a better place than Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Really, because let me tell you, this is a place where the past is very much present. And I can say that with real conviction because Lancaster is where I grew up. I went to school there, and even though I haven't lived there for years, I still think of it as a home. So growing up, there was no getting away from it. Having neighbors, the Amish community, who chose willingly, happily, successfully to live with 1 foot firmly in the 20th century while the rest of us lived with 2 feet in the 20th, didn't seem that unusual. There was a definite sort of temporal fluidity that seemed absolutely normal. It was like living proof of the William Faulkner line that the past is never dead, it's not even past. So living here, you were aware of and constantly reminded that good and important things had once happened. For example, the British captured Philadelphia in 1777. The Continental Congress then fled westward and sheltered in Lancaster, making it briefly the capital of the United States in exile. The Confederacy under Robert E. Lee in 1863 were also on their way to capturing Philadelphia when they were repelled at the border of Lancaster, when locals, aided by the Pennsylvania State Militia's first company of African-American soldiers, burned the mile-long covered bridge at Columbia, denying the Army of Virginia a way to cross the Susquehanna River, forcing them to take a stand a few miles west at a place called Gettysburg, which, as you probably know, did not work out really well for them. Lancaster was also a terminus on the Underground Railroad. To the south of the county is Maryland, and the county's southern border is the Mason-Dixon line. So to the south were slave states, and to the north, free. So Lancaster County was the first free place that many formerly enslaved people were welcomed. And they were welcomed here by pacifist Moravians, Mennonites, and Quaker communities. And Lancaster's commitment to this was made clear in 1851 when a group of armed slave owners from Maryland crossed over the border into Lancaster County. They were trying to enforce, as they saw it, their rights under the newly enacted Fugitive Slave Act. This legislation was bitterly disputed because it allowed Southern slave owners to capture formerly enslaved men, women, and children in free territory in the North. Free territory like Lancaster. So these slavers had pistols, whips, and clubs. However, they were received by a large group of local farmers, mostly black, some white, wielding .50 caliber Pennsylvania long rifles. And in a conflict known as the Christiana Resistance, 3 slavers ended up getting shot, 1 fatally. So, incredibly, after this, 41 members of this, quote, resistance were charged with treason for violating the Fugitive Slave Act. Leading their defense was a Lancastrian named Thaddeus Stevens. And after only 10 minutes of deliberation, a jury found them not guilty. Stevens later became a member of Congress, and there he helped enact the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery and involuntary servitude. Last but not least, in 1984, Harrison Ford was sheltered from corrupt Philadelphia policemen by the local Amish community in the movie Witness by Peter Weir. So, in short, Lancaster was, when I was growing up, clearly on the good guy's side. And on the graph of human progress, things were clearly moving up and to the right. Except for a vaguely remembered, deeply horrific incident that seemed to be a blot on this otherwise stellar civic report card. And this was the extermination of the Conestoga and Susquehannock Indians in the middle of town, where the Opera House now stood. So the Conestoga is the main river running through the county's middle, flowing into the Susquehanna River. The Susquehanna River forms the county's western boundary and is the main watershed for the center of the state of Pennsylvania. And the names of these rivers is where the names of these people come from. So even as a kid, I was aware that while the rivers were there, the people that they were named after were not. They were gone away. To where, I wasn't sure. And for how it happened, this was both a matter of public shame and, as to be expected in a place with a large tourist trade, gleeful sensationalism. And both of these were on full display along the nearby U.S. Route 30 at a place called the National Wax Museum of Lancaster County. It was what we used to call a tourist trap. I suppose, by definition, that's what wax museums are, but at least this one tried to extol some civic virtues of the residents of Lancaster County over the generations. Getting rid of the British, stopping the Confederates, raising Amish barns, you get the picture. All admirable and all mostly true. However, one display stood out to me when I was a kid, starkly against the rest. It was as if Disneyland had hidden a Friday the 13th ride behind the Enchanted Castle. And this was the Massacre of the Conestoga diorama. And I remember it well to this day. The exhibit depicted a small, rustic room with stone walls. In the room were a group of about half a dozen of what appeared to be Native Americans straight out of a low-budget Western. A lot of buckskin, a lot of beads, a lot of braids. They had modest possessions, and their clothes were clearly tattered. Facing them were what looked like a bunch of Swedish guys straight out of the 70s who look like they're auditioning for an ABBA cover band. The men have long blonde hair and are wearing tight pants and puffy white shirts, which is great except for the fact that the men have evidently just broken down the door and are carrying axes. Clearly, something terrible is about to happen. The axes are raised, and the moment is frozen just before the axes come down. This was so jarring, it left a distinct impression on my impressionable 10-year-old brain, one I still have. It also, I thought, presented an open and shut case as far as murders go. So that was it. I thought I knew pretty much all there was to know. A tragic bunch of impoverished Native Americans swindled into hanging out in a jail cell and killed by a bunch of drunk locals who may or may not have looked like ABBA. And as if this wasn't enough, my local natural history museum, the North Museum at Franklin Marshall College, probably my favorite place in town when I was a kid, had a display of Conestoga Susquehannock artifacts, which I mainly found kind of dull compared to the planetarium and live snakes, except for one display case in which there was a replica of an archaeological dig. And in this display was a pile of dirt with seemingly freshly exposed pottery and beads, and in it, partially exposed, was a complete human skeleton, a Susquehannock person, the label told me. They were buried and found with their belongings somewhere in the county. So this was, I imagine, the last of the Susquehannock. The Indians I knew from the diorama were all dead, mostly killed by the frilly shirt guys. But looking back at this now, I start to realize how really odd all this was. What was a human skeleton doing between the rocks and the snakes and the planetarium? The first thing I wanted to do is to see if I misremembered any of this. The Wax Museum is gone, which is sad, but I found a photo online and I've included it in the show notes at itsnothistory.com so you can see for yourself. So I decided to start where this all started for me, in the basement of my local museum filled with rocks and birds and snakes and stuff. Lots and lots of stuff. And at one time, stuff that included the skeleton of a Susquehannock person. I checked. It's not exhibited anymore.
In general, the trend is moving towards we do not display real human remains. The Smithsonian is like that. We're moving away from that. It's not polite.
Molly Wolanski is the collections and exhibits manager at the North Museum in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We're in a storage room in the basement of the North Museum in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I spent all the time I could here as a kid. Lots and lots and lots of stuff. How much stuff?
The collection as a whole, through the entire collection of the museum, we have over 300,000 objects. Archaeology, I'd probably put 50 to 60,000 of that. Some of these larger groupings are like 400 pottery sherds in one box. I mean, if you think about it, archaeology is a lot of looking at people's trash. So a lot of what we have here, we have a lot of broken spear points and like fire pit remains and a lot of stuff like that.
Most of it is the trash left behind by the Conestoga people.
That's what the majority of our collection is. Things that are unintentionally left behind because they're thought to like not really matter. Like today, like if we broke a plate, we would just toss it out.
And much, maybe most of this stuff, however, doesn't legally belong to the museum.
A lot of it is currently tied up in our NAGPRA process, Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. It is federal legislation where anything related to human remains or funerary objects, so basically anything that we grave robbed from the burial sites of the Shents Ferry people and the Susquehannock people, that would need to be returned to their tribal heirs.
So NAGPRA, the Native Graves Protection Repatriation Act, as Wikipedia tells us, is a federal law enacted November 16, 1990. The act requires, quote, federal agencies and institutions that receive federal funding to return Native American cultural items to lineal descendants. Okay, yeah, pretty straightforward. So to be compliant with federal law, the North Museum needs to return these artifacts to lineal descendants of the Susquehannock people. But there's a problem in repatriating these artifacts to Pennsylvania's native people.
Their tribal heirs, which have to be federally recognized as a tribe in order to receive these items, and the Susquehannock are not federally recognized. Like, kind of killed most of the people who were in Pennsylvania pretty quickly.
The Susquehannock, like other native Pennsylvanians, were, quote, removed from the state. As we'll explore in coming episodes, this euphemism, removal, is going to encompass everything from treaty to fraud to murder. The result of this removal process also means that they've largely been removed from memory, erased as a culture. This is Kevin Kenny.
You'll find in the back of the Opera House, the old Opera House in Lancaster, you'll find a little memorial plaque there. If you look hard, you'll find one out in Conestoga, but it's simply not part of the memory. And I think that's one of the saddest elements of this story, is that it's forgotten. In Pennsylvania today, there are no native tribes or nations that have state or federal recognition.
So California recognizes 109 native tribes. The tiny state of Delaware, next to Pennsylvania, has 2 native tribes that it recognizes. Pennsylvania, the 5th most populous state in the nation, has 0. Not one tribe that it recognizes. No Susquehannock land, no Susquehannock reservations, and not just the Conestoga or Susquehannock. Of all the dozens, maybe even hundreds of tribal groups that at one time or another called this territory, now called Pennsylvania, their home, not one of them is recognized inside the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is one of only 9 states that doesn't recognize any native tribes, either state or federal. For all intents and purposes, Pennsylvania is, for Native American culture, a desert. But okay, let's contrast with the community that hunted down the last of the Conestoga Susquehannock, Paxton. So here's a weird mirror image of the legacy of the Paxtons in Conestoga, because Paxton is still here, and it's really lovely. Paxton Township is now a leafy suburb of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the state capital. The church where the best-known member of the Paxton community, a Presbyterian clergyman named John Elder, a guy we'll hear about in future episodes, the church where he held service still stands.
John Elder, who was the pastor of Paxton Presbyterian Church and the leader of the Paxton Rangers, later the Paxton Boys.
This is Jack Brubaker.
John Elder owned the largest home in Harrisburg. It's still the largest home in Harrisburg. It's on an acre of land. So he was a very well-to-do guy and made money here and became powerful leaders.
Kevin Kenny.
Now, Elder, known as the fighting pastor, I don't think he ever did any fighting. He did command that militia. And if you go to Paxton Presbyterian Church, there is a rifle on the wall, which is a very vivid illustration of what we're talking about here, right?
So I visited there recently, and while I couldn't find the rifle, the church itself is beautiful, recently renovated. It's a rough-hewn fieldstone building with a modest but immaculate interior and an elevated pulpit that looks majestically over neat rows of walnut pews. And a plaque there honors John Elder as a, quote, frontiersman and later brave patriot of the American Revolution. So John Elder is buried along with other notables of that period in a well-maintained cemetery next to the church, including John Harris, the founder of Harrisburg, as well as a lot of other members of the Elder family, and, full disclosure, a lot of Stuarts. So while my branch of the Stuart clan wouldn't show up on these shores for another 100 years or so, these are my people, the Scots-Irish diaspora in America, a group whose history and experience we'll also hear a lot about in coming episodes, because their history and how they ended up here and why they were kept here is crucial to understanding the story. So figuring out who the Paxton Boys were is both easier and harder. We know they immigrated from Scotland via Ireland, called the Scots-Irish here in this country, and that they settled in Paxton Township, and that their name was literally their address, Paxton Boys, Paxton Township. The problem is that while in their time, who they were was well known, because they committed mass murder in the middle of town in the middle of the day, and, as we'll see in coming episodes, they were, as a mob, not afraid to stand in public after these events and share their, quote, grievances, as they saw it, sometimes in writing, about what they did, to who, and why. But their identities as individuals were concealed from any public record. And while a few names are suspected, including, full disclosure, a guy named
Lazarus Stewart. Yeah, what a name. It's a good Scottish and Scots-Irish name. Lazarus Stewart, I mean, you picture him as a figure striding across the Old Testament. So he's striding across Pennsylvania. He is one of the leaders of the Paxton Boys in 1763.
So other than a member of my family clan and a few others, the actual who of who did this in this murder mystery has been lost to history, and not by accident. So, by the way, quick spoiler alert. If you're hoping, expecting that there'll be a resolution here where the Paxton Boys are named, uncovered, caught, prosecuted, where justice is served, change the channel now. You're not going to get it. No one has ever been found, ever identified, ever brought to trial for these crimes, ever. Okay, so as we saw in the first chapter, the roving menace that was the Paxton Boys exploded on the scene, intent on destroying the Conestoga and everyone like them. But how did these two different groups, different cultures, end up in a collision course here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in a place that's world-famously pacifistic and benevolent, an area that's populated by Quakers and Mennonites and Amish? Why here? Before we get to the why, though, let's start with the who. Who were these people? And one of the many strange ironies of this story, as we're going to discover, is that while the identities of the Paxtons has been concealed, hidden, lost to history, the identities of their victims is actually well known, not lost to history at all, because the names of the Conestoga town people who died in the room in Lancaster were written down and recorded shortly after they were murdered, and before, as we'll see, they were dumped unceremoniously into an unmarked mass grave. So Paxton culture, still here, occupying the same land on which still stands the biggest house in town, and now America's oldest Presbyterian church. And Conestoga Susquehannock, no land and not recognized as even existing by the state or national government, but a really nice little plaque on the back of the old Opera House. At least someone bothered to write down their names before they were buried behind it. So join us next time as we try to uncover who these people were, Paxton and Conestoga, and how they ended up on this collision course here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So we'll start with the people who were here first, the Conestoga Susquehannock. And if we're going to get a full picture of them in this place, their place, then we need to take a step back, way back, into a time that's older and stranger than I could have ever imagined. And we'll look at how the first people, ancestors of the Conestoga Susquehannock, coming across the land, made this their home. And then how the next people, Europeans, coming across the water, discovered the hard way that it wasn't their home. So join us then for It's Not History. Thanks for listening. So go to itsnothistory.com. You can find show notes, resources, and photos, including a photo of the Paxton Conestoga diorama at the Wax Museum in Lancaster. I was not kidding. And if you liked this, please remember to subscribe and share it with someone you like. They will thank you for it. I'd like to thank our guests and contributors, Molly Wolanski, Debbie Saylor, Michael Mantooth, Lee Francis, Kevin Kenny, Will Fenton, and the amazing Jack Brubaker. Today's music is by Cineas, Universe Field, and the theme music is by Evgeny Sorokin. And remember, the past is never dead. It's not even past. Thanks for listening.